The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder.
It's official. Convicted murderer Wade Wilson is sentenced to death for 2 gruesome murders he committed back in 2019. And here's what he's got to say for it.
Well, Mr. Wilson, you have an opportunity, just like during any of the other phases of... Well, let me just finish real quick.
You heard that right. Wade Wilson interrupted the judge of his case during his sentencing hearing. But he did have to listen as prosecutors explained why he deserved death, the heinousness of both murders.
Wilson's decisions were not only pitiless and consciencelessness, but they amounted to tragically reducing Miss Melton as well as Miss Ruiz to nothing more than memories and photographs. The state would respectfully request this court to recommend and impose the sentence of death upon Mr. Wilson, because not only is it deserved, but it's earned.
But Wilson's defense wasn't silent in all this. They tried to highlight some mitigating factors, basically saying that Wilson had traumatic brain injuries, and that should mean death was taken off the table.
Either sentence is a terrible sentence. The sentence of death is worse in that if there is a mistake along the way and we can't correct that mistake, we can't correct the sentence after it's imposed.
So let's jump right in to hear the arguments from both sides and what we can expect ahead for Wilson. The Wade Wilson trial was a major one here on Law and Crime. It happened back in June, and that's kind of when Wilson exploded on TikTok. His face is all over videos there, and honestly, it's a pretty memorable one. But so too are the crimes he's now convicted of. I'll let prosecutors explain this part.
Let's start with a capital felony was a homicide that was committed in cold, calculated, and a premeditated manner without any pretense of moral or legal justification. You already found beyond a reasonable doubt that the murders were premeditated through your verdict. You found 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. You must now find that that premeditation was heightened, demonstrated by a substantial period of reflection. In order to do that, I think it's important to start at the beginning of this case, where it all happened, off McGregor Boulevard, near College Parkway, at the Buddha Lounge. Music was playing, people were socializing. The defendant went there to have a good time, and he discarded the woman he came with, and he chose one that caught his eye, Christine Melton. And as he told detectives, this is what I do with women, you know. I use my charm, I use my good looks. That's what I did with the first girl, and that's how I got in her head. And look what happened to her. When the defendant first approaches Christine, he's not threatening. He's smooth, he's charming. He's nice to her and her friend Stephanie. They party together, no red flags, no sign of aggression. He's a fun guy, but he waits. He waits until he's back at her house, in her bed, and Stephanie has gone home. He waits until he is alone with her, until there are no other witnesses. He waits until she is asleep, defenseless. The defendant says she can't get away from him, even if she wanted to, because he's too strong. And when she can't get away is when he kills her, when he strangles her, because he was the lion and she was the prey.
As prosecutors explained, Wilson met 35-year-old Christine Melton at a bar with live music in Fort Myers, Florida on October 6, 2019. And then, as prosecutors described, he strangled her to death after she took him back to her Cape Coral home. Here's how Wilson's biological father explained it.
Did he end up calling you later that evening?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he tell you in that call that evening?
The final call?
Nope, the call before the final call.
He just told me, you know, he did something. There was 2 people gone that would not be back. He said, I'm a killer. You know, I just told him to call me back. I just thought it was another story you know.
So at this point, when he says that there were two people that wouldn't be with us and that he was a killer, did you put a lot of weight into that?
No, ma'am.
Do you think he was just telling you a story?
He's a good storyteller. He just said he met a girl at a bar. They went back to her house, hung out for a little bit, and then she fell asleep.
What did he say happened after she fell asleep?
He said he got on top of her and choked her.
What name did he call her? Did he refer to her in a derogatory term?
He said, I choked that.
And here's Wilson's account of what happened in a jailhouse call made to his ex-girlfriend.
Well, then tell me what happened then. I just heard it.
Killed the.
Why, Wade? Why?
Because we went to this dude's house, Mila, and remember when he kept showing us the pictures? Oh, I got this, to get this, or whatever?
Yes.
So I went to his house, and I did a lot of it. Like, he was giving me a lot. And I was doing a lot of...
Why did you kill the girl?
Huh?
Why did you kill that girl?
I shouldn't have. I'm wrong.
Tell me what happened. Did you have sex with her? You went and killed her? What?
No, I didn't have sex with her. I killed her, though.
That phone call was between Wilson and his ex-girlfriend Mila. And according to prosecutors, after he killed Christine Melton, he stole her car and then went to see Mila. At that point, they got into an argument and Wilson physically attacked Mila. You'll hear about that later. It's his battery charge in this case. Mila was able to escape, so Wilson then took off in Melton's car. And that's when he found his second victim, 43-year-old Diane Ruiz. She was walking down the street on the way to work when Wilson pulled over and pretended to ask for directions. Ruiz hopped into the car, and here's what Wilson says happened next.
Yeah, but did you kill the second girl at that point?
No. I think I killed her later.
You think?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did. I killed her after I told you.
This stuff. These
What,
are like usually things that people remember when they kill somebody.
I killed her after I told you.
Why? Why couldn't you just rob her? Why did you have to kill her?
I'm sorry. I don't know.
Why? I kind of want to know why. What was going through your head when you're killing her? So I heard that you choked her out. She didn't die. She got up and ran. You ran her over with the car. Is that how it went?
Yeah, it is. She didn't get up and run. That's not true. I choked her out, pushed her out of the car, and then I ran her over with the car.
How did you get her in the car?
She got in by herself.
So she got in the car by herself.
Yeah.
And you took her out in the car.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Pushed her out of the car, and then you
ran her over. Yeah, like 10
Do you
times.
not hear yourself?
Yes, Mila, I do. I hear myself.
Does this sound like something that you want to be saying out loud? Can you believe that you've done this?
No, I can't. I really can't. I was on drugs, dude. I really can't believe it.
So here's how Wilson's defense argued all this.
He's got a diseased mind. We can't relate to that. It's hard for us to know what's going through his head when he's talking to law enforcement.
You can see where this is going. Here's what the jury came back with.
As to count 1, first-degree murder, Christine Melton, we, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that the first-degree murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Yes. We, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that the first-degree murder was committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner without any pretense of moral or legal justification. We, the jury, find by a vote of 9-3 that Wade Wilson should be sentenced to death. As to count 4, first-degree murder, Diane Ruiz, we, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that the first-degree murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Yes. We, the jury, find by a vote of 10-2 that Wade Wilson should be sentenced to death.
So the jury recommended death for Wilson on both counts, but the official sentence wasn't handed down right away. Instead, Wilson's defense had several months to come up with mitigating factors, reasons why their client shouldn't receive the death penalty. This would then be presented to Judge Nicholas Thompson, and he would make the final decision. This sentencing hearing was first scheduled for July, but then pushed back. And just last week, Wilson's team had him sent out for brain scans, like an MRI, because experts said there are signs he had traumatic brain injury. So that leads us to August 27th, the day of Wilson's sentencing. Before the judge's ruling was officially made, there was a Spencer hearing, meaning both sides could present mitigating or aggravating factors in Wilson's case. We begin with the defense and their expert witness, Dr. Mark Rubino.
There are two basic conclusions. One, with the ventricular asymmetry. Ventricular asymmetry can be a normal finding, but in the setting of psychiatric disease, it indicates cognitive and emotional dysfunction.
Okay. How does that manifest itself in somebody's conduct?
It's going to cause worse behavior. It's going to cause less thinking. It's going to cause less likely to modify your own behavior, basically.
Okay. What was the other one? You said there were two.
Evidence of some brain injury. The atrophy of his superior anterior temporal lobes as well as his frontal lobes is an important combination. When you have atrophy of your amygdala, which is one of your main points of your limbic system, it creates for emotional instability. It makes you more likely to get mad and not be able to calm yourself down. The frontal lobe impairments cause one to be more likely to be impulsive and act without regard to consequence, act without plan, more likely to be irritated and agitated, and the frontal lobe is also important for stopping behavior arising out of your temporal lobe.
That you had the opportunity to review that were taken on August 21st of 2024, isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right. Matter of fact, the MRI scans also revealed that there was a unremarkable conventional brain MRI examined without contrast. Do you agree with that assessment, sir?
From a perspective of major disease, stroke, MS, anything you look at, yeah, it looks normal.
Matter of fact, the findings in the MRI scans were that the ventricles are normal in size and position without evidence for hydrocephalus.
There is no hydrocephalus. In fact, the ventricles are relatively small, indicating that he may have increased intracranial pressure.
And then we also find that the fourth ventricle is midline and no shift is noted, right?
Yeah, that's brainstem. That's fine.
Medical speak aside, Dr. Rubino says the damage to Wilson's brain could make him have tumultuous relationships. And in this next clip, he gets a little sassy about it.
These findings are likely predating 2019, probably sometime after he was a teenager.
Well, if they're predating 2019, you would expect some kind of symptoms to be present at that point in time, would you not?
Impulsiveness, agitation. How do I know that's not there? I would say that it's likely that he had those things then.
Really? Well, you didn't bother to go ahead and speak to Mr. Lukic or Miss Stephanie Johnson, who had contact with him. You didn't have contact with Miss Melissa Montanez, who could tell you a little bit more about her contact with Mr. Wilson, did you, sir?
I did not know them. How am I supposed to contact them?
Now let's move on to the prosecution side of things, where another medical expert was called to testify. And shockingly, this doctor, a forensic pathologist, disagreed with what the defense said.
And so based on that, do you believe there's anything significant?
No, and I'll tell you further why, right? So if you had asymmetry in the ventricles, or let's say, for instance, he also described that there was an abnormality in the size of the ventricles, that they were actually more narrow or smaller. They're not. This is actually appropriate in size. And he suggested that because of that, there's probably due to increased intracranial pressure. But that doesn't happen in isolation. Increased intracranial pressure is going to cause fluid from the ventricles as well as fluid from the vascular space to spill out into the actual brain tissue, and that's going to cause abnormalities in the CSF pattern, as well as it's going to cause hyperintensities around vessels. You see none of that here in this actual scan whatsoever. Not to mention, increased intracranial pressure is going to push the brain parenchyma out. The brain is trapped in the skull. It has nowhere to go. So if you increase pressure inside that skull, the brain is going to be pushed outward and downward. And you see no evidence of that at all here. You don't see any evidence. You see the normal sulsation right here, or the normal folds of the brain. You have no evidence of that increased intracranial pressure. More importantly, like I said, there's no overt evidence of abnormality in ventricle size, and that matches what the radiologist saw on both the CAT scan and the MRI.
This next part is the prosecution's mic drop.
I would call this a structurally normal adult brain, and I wouldn't be concerned about anything significant to chase after.
Here's where we hear from Wilson for the first time, and pay close attention. He starts speaking earlier than you'd expect.
Well, Mr. Wilson, you have an opportunity, just like during any of the other phases of, well, let me just finish real quick. Any other phases during the case, if you want to address the court, I would permit you to do that. Obviously, everything's recorded. But you would have that opportunity if you wish. No one can prevent you from addressing the court if you wish to, and no one can make you address the court if you don't want to. So it is a decision that's solely left up to you if you want to address the court or not.
Not today. Later, when I come back, I will. Today,
okay.
No, I won't.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Inching closer to that official sentence now, with final arguments from both sides. The defense went first, and as you can expect, asked the judge to reconsider the death sentence.
We'd ask that the court consider the 3 statutory mitigators, the capacity of the defendant to appreciate the criminal nature of the conduct or to conform that conduct to the requirements of the law was substantially impaired. Obviously, you've heard testimony that he consumed quantity of controlled substances. He described it to the officers, said it basically made him almost insane. Defendant requires specialized treatment for mental disorder that is unrelated to substance abuse or addiction or for a physical disability, and the defendant is amenable to treatment. We don't know what kind of treatment that's going to be on death row. We know that he needs treatment. There's testimony to the fact that he's been on treatment. He's been on the same treatment throughout his stay in the Department of Corrections and in the Lee County Jail. He needs that medication. He needs that treatment. Defendant cooperated with the state to resolve the current offense or any other offenses. I'm sure the court recalls that Mr. Wilson provided a statement to law enforcement. At the time he provided the statement, he was not aware that they had located the second victim. He was doing that in an effort to assist the victim's family. They had already located the second victim, but he didn't know that. He provided them with details that, but for his statement, they would never have known. We have non-statutory mitigating circumstances. Defendant was born to drug-addicted teenage parents. The defendant's biological mother suffered mental illness. Defendant's mental illness presented at age 12 and was precipitated by puberty and substance abuse. Defendant was diagnosed bipolar disorder, and I call it schizophrenia. It's a little bit different diagnosis. Defendant is loved by his adoptive parents, Candy and Steve Wilson, who has provided a statement to the court. Defendant is loved by his sister, which was reflected in the statement read to the jury. Defendant was profoundly affected by being abandoned by his biological parents. He's been a loving son to his adoptive parents, as reflected in the statement read earlier today. I remind the court that the jury's recommendation was 9-3 for one victim and 10-2 for the other. under their previous statute, that would have required this court to sentence my client to life. We'd ask the court to take into consideration that death is permanent. Death is different, and we're asking the court to impose 2 life sentences for Mr. Wilson.
That last statement from the defense perfectly teed up the prosecution for this.
I'd like to point out, and I agree with defense counsel, that death is in fact permanent. Christine Melton was 35 years old. Diane Ruiz was 43 years old. Both of their deaths were permanent. Back in June, when this court heard the facts and circumstances of this particular case surrounding the deaths of Miss Melton and Miss Ruiz, this court should have learned that this case was nothing more than power, control, and violence that led to murder. Mr. Wilson's decisions were not only pitiless and consciencelessness, but they amounted to tragically reducing Miss Melton as well as Miss Ruiz to nothing more than memories and photographs, to not only their families, but also to their friends. The only reason why that happened was because they both encountered Mr. Wilson. Wilson went ahead and placed his hands around the necks of both of these women and allowed their lives to slip through his fingers when both of them knew they were going to die. The jury found that particular factor, Judge, unanimously, as to both Miss Melton and Miss Ruiz, that it was heinous, atrocious, and cruel. He overpowered them, he controlled them, he silenced them by placing his hands around their neck. Judge, we submit to you that factor should be given extremely great weight. And lastly, Judge, the aggravating factor of it being cold, calculated, and premeditated. The jury found, beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, unanimously, that this aggravating factor applied to Miss Diane Ruiz. And as such, Judge, the state would respectfully request this court to recommend and impose the sentence of death upon Mr. Wilson, because not only is it deserved, but it's earned.
After considering all the factors, here's what the judge had to say.
In the state of Florida versus Stephen Wade Wilson, the court has further considered the giving great weight to the advisory verdict of the jury, who recommended that the death penalty be imposed by a vote of 9-3 on count 1 for the murder of Christine Melton and a vote of 10-2 on count 4 for the murder of Diane Ruiz. The court recognizes that there is no mathematical formula for considering the aggravating and mitigating factors. It is not enough to weigh the number of aggravators against the number of mitigators. The court carefully considered the nature and quality of each aggravator and mitigator. Having reviewed all of the aggravating factors proven beyond a reasonable doubt and all of the mitigating circumstances reasonably established by the evidence, the court finds that the aggravating factors greatly outweigh mitigating circumstances. Given the facts of the case, nothing in defendant's background or mental state would suggest that a death sentence is inappropriate. This court's review of other reported capital cases has led the court to conclude that the death penalty is not disproportionate in this case. Under the totality of the circumstances and evidence, the court finds no basis to override the jury's verdict. The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder. Accordingly, it is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced as follows. Count 1, first-degree murder of Christine Melton. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 2, grand theft of a motor vehicle. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 3, battery. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in the Lee County Jail. Count 4, first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 5, the burglary of a dwelling. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 6, petty theft. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in Lee County Jail. The defendant is given credit for all time served on this case on all counts. All counts are to run concurrent with each other, meaning at the same time. All statutorily mandated fines, fees, and costs as announced on the record are imposed, and the defendant is committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for execution of this sentence as provided by law.
And here's the reaction after Wilson's sentence was handed down.
We saw justice served for victims Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz as defendant Wade Wilson was sentenced to death for the horrendous, atrocious, and cruel crimes that he committed. He was sentenced by the Honorable Nick Thompson, and this was the appropriate sentence for this evil monster. The defendant in this case will now sit on Florida's death row as he awaits the death penalty. He will pay the ultimate price, the highest penalty we carry in Florida, because of the heinous, atrocious, and cruel things he did to these two victims. The decision by my office to seek the death penalty in this case, the recommendation of death by the jury, and the sentencing of the defendant to death today is a reflection of the severity of the crimes committed and the irreversible harm inflicted upon innocent lives.
For now, Wade Wilson is still being held at the Lee County Jail in Fort Myers, Florida. He's still got a few more charges that need to be resolved, including a failed escape attempt. After all that is taken care of, he'll eventually be transferred to Union Correctional Institution, where all Florida death row inmates are held. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.